I let Marcus think I was just lonely. Everyone does. They see the pictures of our missing retriever and assume I'm grieving a pet, not a person. But the truth is, I handed Duke over to the man I slept with for 3 months. Now my husband wants to file a police report for dognapping, and my sister says I've been emotionally compromised since the miscarriage. They're both wrong. The real danger isn't legal trouble or grief. It's that I orchestrated this entire disaster because I wanted to punish Kyle for working too much, and I can't undo any of it. I'm going to explain exactly how I went from borrowing sugar to giving away my family, but you should know up front the dog was never stolen. I signed the adoption papers over to David the day before he moved, and I told myself it was temporary. The silence in our house started long before David moved in next door. After I lost the baby in March, Kyle threw himself into his consulting contracts, traveling to Phoenix and Denver 4 days a week. He'd come home smelling like hotel soap and avoid looking at the empty nursery I'd started painting yellow. Duke would press his golden head against my thigh, his tail thumping against the hardwood, and I'd scratch his ears until my fingers went numb. That was the only touch that didn't feel like it required explanation. When David knocked on our door with a housewarming pie crust, his boxer shorts peeking from his waistband and his shirt inside out, I noticed how Duke's entire body wagged at him. "He's a handsome boy," David said, kneeling to let Duke lick his chin. I'd later learn the boxers were from his ex-wife's goodbye package, the shirt Mies buttoned because he'd been drinking since noon. Kyle missed that whole interaction naturally. He was on a client call, using that voice he reserves for people who pay him $300 an hour. I found myself watching David's window that evening, seeing the blue flicker of his television. The next morning he was in his driveway, wrestling with a broken garbage disposal he'd pulled from his sink. I brought him coffee. By the weekend, he was helping me dig a vegetable patch I didn't actually want. When Kyle commented that the yard looked nice, I didn't mention David's blistered palms. I just said I'd hired someone. The lie tasted metallic like biting a fence. My sister Laura called while I was watering the tomatoes David had planted. "You're spending a lot of time over there," she observed, and I laughed, said David was harmless, a 40-year-old man-child whose wife had left him for their fertility doctor. The way I described it, she sounded predatory, not him. That should have been my first clue. At 420 words, I realized I was teaching Duke to respond to David's whistle, a sharp two-tone I'd heard him use on his late father's hunting dogs. I told myself it was just good training. By June, David and I had a rhythm. He'd text me pictures of Duke chasing squirrels in his yard, "Your kid's trespassing again," and I'd send back eye-roll emojis while Kyle read spreadsheets at the kitchen table. The dramatic irony of my life had become its own genre, the wife who thinks she's found friendship when she's actually building a bomb. Kyle's obliviousness felt like permission. David listened to me describe the D&C procedure in detail, how they'd used words like product of conception, as if my baby were a defective item to be returned. Kyle still couldn't say the word miscarriage without his jaw tightening. When David put his hand on my shoulder during one of these talks, I leaned into it. At 600 words, I told my reflection that physical comfort between friends was normal. The fact that I'd stopped wearing a bra when I went over there was just practical. Arizona summers and all that. Laura showed up unannounced on a Tuesday, catching me in David's kitchen, both of us flour-dusted and laughing about a failed souffle. Her eyes flicked from my tank top to David's bare chest to the way our hips were angled toward each other. "Kyle's looking for you," she lied. "He was in Phoenix." I knew it, she knew it, David knew it. That night she texted, "Whatever you're doing, stop, I can see it on your face." I deleted the message and sent David a picture of Duke sleeping in his laundry basket. The unraveling had already started, I just hadn't admitted it yet. The first time I slept with David, it was August and the AC had died. I'd gone over to escape the heat, wearing shorts so short Kyle would have commented. David was already in bed, shirtless, reading some book about dog psychology. Duke was curled at his feet. I remember thinking how natural it looked, this makeshift family. When David moved the book and patted the mattress, I didn't pretend to hesitate. The sex was transactional in its honesty, nothing to prove, no one to impress. After I used his bathroom and saw his ex-wife's monogrammed towels, I used them anyway. At 1080 words, I sent Kyle a text saying Duke and I were camping in the backyard. I bought a tent for this exact purpose, for the lies that required props. Kyle replied cool 30 minutes later. That was the moment I understood his indifference had become my weapon. Laura found the text by accident. She'd borrowed my phone during a family dinner, claiming hers had died, and saw David's name with a heart emoji I'd added while drunk. The confrontation happened in her car afterward, with Kyle still inside paying the bill. "How long?" she demanded, and I said, "Since the tomatoes came in," which made no sense but felt like the truth. She cried, actual tears smudging her mascara. "You're going to lose everything." I told her she was being dramatic. The real risk, I insisted, was Kyle finding out how much I'd come to hate the person he'd become after the miscarriage. At 1320 words, she asked if I'd given David a key. I hadn't, but I'd given him the garage code, which was the same thing. The next morning, I changed my phone password to Duke's birthday. The paperwork had been my idea. David mentioned his ex was threatening to sue for his own dog, a shepherd mix he'd left behind in the split. If Duke were legally yours, I said, stirring sugar into his coffee, she couldn't touch him. I meant it as a hypothetical. But then I pulled up the adoption documents from the shelter, the ones in my name because Kyle had been too busy to come sign. I'd scanned them after we got Duke 3 years ago. At 1440 words, I realized I could print them. I could sign Kyle's name in that messy scrawl I'd perfected on grocery lists. I told myself it was protection, not theft. That night, I practiced his signature 17 times on a notepad before getting it right. When David's ex-wife showed up at his door in September, screaming about alimony and the shepherd, I was in his living room. She saw my car in the driveway, my shoes by his door. "I know you're in there, Claire," she shrieked, and I froze, thinking she'd somehow learned my name from the universe's own gossip column. David handled it, but the neighbors were watching. Mrs. Chen from across the street started closing her blinds when I walked Duke. The mailman made eye contact that lasted too long. 1680 words, I told David we needed to be more careful. He misunderstood, thinking I wanted to end things. His face crumpled in a way that made me realize I'd become his life raft. So I said, "I think Kyle's getting suspicious. Maybe you should take Duke for a few weeks." The lie was so clean, so perfect. It solved every problem at once. The signature was my masterpiece. I'd printed the transfer of ownership form on cardstock, used Kyle's business stamp from his home office. I even backdated it to before the affair started, just in case. David watched me forge it, his hand on my back, neither of us speaking. "This way," I whispered, "if anything happens, he's yours." I meant legally, I meant forever, but I told David it was temporary until things calmed down. I gave him the original vaccination records, the microchip information, Duke's favorite blanket. 1920 words, I told him Kyle had been talking about rehoming Duke anyway, that he blamed the dog for tracking mud into the nursery we'd never use. The abuse lie slipped out so naturally I barely noticed. "He's rough with him sometimes," I added, and David's jaw set in a way that made me feel protected and powerful at once. I was building David's justification for me, creating a narrative where he rescued us both. Kyle noticed the blanket was gone first. "Where's his lucky blanket?" he asked, and I said I'd washed it. It was in the dryer that was empty. I watched him open and close the door 3 times, confusion settling on his face like dust. "I'll check the garage," I offered, and he let me because by then I'd become the expert on all things domestic, the keeper of the inventory. He didn't know I'd already packed Duke's backup leash and the expensive CBD treats. They were in David's guest room closet waiting. At 2100 words, I wondered if I was preparing David for a life with Duke or a life with both of us. The thought made me giddy and terrified. I took a picture of the empty dog bed and sent it to David with the caption "Soon." The breaking point began with a spreadsheet. Kyle decided he wanted to itemize our expenses for tax season, something we usually did together in November. But he started in October this year, likely prompted by his accountant. He asked for Duke's vet bills, the adoption papers, proof of ownership for the microchip. I handed him a folder I'd prepared weeks ago, real receipts, fake papers. He didn't notice the signature was wrong. He didn't notice the date was off. He just filed them away, trusting me completely. At 2520 words, I felt the ground shift. This was the moment I understood that my deception had become infrastructure, load-bearing walls in the architecture of our marriage. Laura stopped calling after I missed her daughter's birthday party. I told her I was sick, but she'd driven by and seen my car gone, Duke's leash missing from the hook by our door. Her final text read, "You're not the person I thought you were." I deleted it, but the words had already etched themselves into my bones. Kyle's mother called next, asking if everything was okay, if we needed help with the dog. I said Duke was at a training camp, a 2-week intensive I'd read about online. She offered to pay for it. I gave her David's Venmo. At 2880 words, I was running a full-scale embezzlement scheme disguised as pet care, and the person I'd become didn't recognize the one who'd planted those tomatoes. The injury was mine, but Kyle paid for it. I'd been drinking wine at David's, celebrating the successful transfer of ownership, when I tripped over Duke's water bowl. The glass shattered, sliced my ankle. David drove me to urgent care while Kyle was still in Denver. I told them I'd been home alone cooking. The doctor stitched me up, gave me antibiotics. When Kyle came home and saw the bandage, he actually looked concerned. "What happened?" he asked, and for a second the truth perched on my tongue. Then David texted, "Is your ankle okay?" And I saw Kyle's eyes track the notification on my phone screen. At 3180 words, he didn't ask who David was. He just went to the garage and started sanding the bookshelves for the nursery, the repetitive motion of his arm somehow more damning than any accusation. The direct question came 2 days later. Kyle had found the heart emoji texts not by snooping, but because I'd left my phone open while showering. Duke still there, still mine legally but emotionally already David's, had knocked it off the counter with his tail. Kyle read enough. Are you cheating on me? He asked, standing in the doorway with my phone in his hand. He looked more tired than angry, like he'd been carrying a weight and finally wanted to set it down. I could have confessed everything. Instead, I said, define cheating. At 3480 words, that was my worst decision yet. Not the affair, not the forgery, but that semantic deflection that told Kyle I valued my own technical innocence over his actual pain. He nodded slowly, turned, and packed a bag. He said he'd be at a hotel. He didn't ask about Duke. David announced his move on a rainy Thursday. He got a job offer in Portland, something about a brewery needing a manager. He'd been a brewmaster before the divorce before he'd come here to start over. I can't take Duke, he said, and I realized he was breaking up with both of us, me and the dog. I panicked. I showed him the signed papers, the ones with Kyle's forged signature. He's yours, I insisted. I made him yours. David looked at the documents like they were radioactive. Claire, he whispered, what did you do? At 3660 words, I told him about the abuse lie. I said Kyle had been getting rough, that I'd seen him kick Duke's bowl. None of it was true, but I made my voice tremble with manufactured trauma. David's face hardened with protective fury. I'll take him, he said. I'll take him right now. I helped him load Duke's crate into his truck, the rain soaking through my shirt. Kyle drove past as we were closing the tailgate. He didn't stop. The confession begins with paperwork. That's what I tell my therapist now, the one I started seeing after Kyle served me divorce papers. It was always about the paperwork. But the truth is messier. At 4020 words, I admitted to her that I'd researched how to legally transfer pet ownership in our state. I'd printed the forms from a pit bull rescue website, modified them in Photoshop. I'd practiced Kyle's signature until it was flawless. I'd notarized it myself using a stamp I'd bought online. The therapist asked why. I said, because I wanted Duke to have a better life. She asked if that was the only reason. I said no. I said I wanted Kyle to lose something he loved since he'd let me lose something I loved. The miscarriage hung between us, heavy and unaddressed. The most damning detail is the timeline. Kyle found the original adoption certificate while looking for our marriage license for the divorce proceedings. It was in my name only. He'd never signed it, which meant when I transferred ownership to David, I was exercising a legal right Kyle didn't know I had. But the forgery meant I'd committed fraud. The abuse lie meant I'd slandered him. The heart emoji meant I'd been cruel. At 4320 words, David called Kyle directly. He apologized for the affair, confirmed Duke was safe, and said, Claire told me you were hurting him. Kyle's lawyer recorded the call. It became evidence in the custody dispute over the dog, not children. The absurdity of two grown men fighting over a golden retriever while I sat in my apartment alone should have been humiliating. But I felt nothing. The fallout was immediate and cellular. Kyle's sister unfriended me on Facebook, posting pictures of Duke, with the caption, "Miss you, buddy," that her followers assumed was about the divorce. Laura spoke to a reporter from our local paper doing a story on pet custody battles, painting me as unstable. Mrs. Chen started a neighborhood watch group specifically to monitor my house. I got 3 noise complaints for crying too loudly. At 4620 words, I learned David had been honest about Portland. He'd sent me one photo of Duke on a beach, then blocked my number. The dog looked happy. That was supposed to be the point, but it felt like a kidney punch. I'd given away the only creature who'd still loved me unconditionally. The final shoe dropped when Kyle found the practice signatures. I'd left the notepad in the junk drawer, the one with his name written 17 times in different styles. He thought I was planning identity theft. My lawyer explained it was just marital deception, which sounds better but hurts the same. At 4,800 words, Kyle told me he would have given me Duke. He said, if you'd said you needed something to love, I would have understood. He couldn't see that asking would have required admitting the miscarriage had hollowed me out, that his absence had felt like abandonment, that I'd replaced our baby with a dog and then given the dog away to punish him. The logic was so twisted I couldn't speak it aloud. The unexpected consequence was Duke's return. David's brewery job fell through after 3 weeks. He couldn't afford pet deposits on rentals. He called Laura, not me, and asked if Kyle wanted the dog back. Kyle drove to Portland and retrieved Duke, but when I asked to see him, Kyle sent a single text, "You waived that right." The dog I'd used as currency, as collateral damage, as a living metaphor for my brokenness, was now a reminder of my replacement. Mrs. Chen posted a video of Kyle and Duke playing fetch in the park, captioned, "Happy endings do exist." I liked it, then unliked it, then cried for an hour. At 5,100 words, I realized the punishment wasn't losing Kyle. It was watching him rebuild the life I'd tried to burn down, and seeing him do it better without me. Genuine self-awareness came during a deposition. Kyle's lawyer asked me to describe my state of mind when I signed the papers. I started with the miscarriage, the loneliness, the tomatoes. The lawyer interrupted. "Mrs. Peterson, did you want to get caught?" I said no automatically, but walking back to my car I understood. Of course I had. Entire performance, the sloppy lies, the open phone, the notepad of signatures, it was all designed to blow up my life because I didn't have the courage to simply leave it. At 5340 words, I admitted this to my therapist. She said, "That's progress." I said, "It's too late." My current state is a one-bedroom apartment 3 miles from the house I shared with Kyle. The house with the vegetable patch David planted, now overgrown with weeds. The house where Duke's empty bed still sits in the garage. I see them sometimes, Kyle and Duke, walking through the neighborhood like a normal man and his normal dog. Kyle started dating someone from his firm. She has a beagle. Duke walks between them, perfectly content. At 5520 words, Kyle emailed me the final divorce decree. In the message he wrote, "For what it's worth, I did love you. I just didn't know you needed me to prove it by staying home." He didn't mention the dog. He didn't have to. I'm telling this story now because Kyle found the practice signatures last week, not 3 months ago. He waited to see if I'd confess. When I didn't, he changed the locks. That's what finally broke me, not the affair, not the forgery, but the fact that I'd become someone whose husband felt the need to change his locks. The pictures of Duke I post online get comments like, "So sorry for your loss and hope you find him soon." I never correct them. I let them misunderstand because it's easier than admitting I gave away the only thing that still trusted me. If you're wondering what kind of person does this, the answer is simple: someone who mistook being needed for being loved and destroyed both trying to prove the difference. You can judge me. God knows I do. But if you've ever wanted someone to notice you're drowning, maybe you'll understand why